Hello. Today I'd like to talk about how making an indie game is hard. And making games in general is very, very challenging. That's been my experience. I think, if you look at on the AAA industry or whatever, all the overtime and all the effort that's been poured into these games that we know and love, I think everyone would agree that making them is hard. I think making indie games is especially hard, and I think there's a couple reasons for that. I guess one could argue that with Unity and whatnot, that making an indie game is easy as ever. But I guess what I'm talking about specifically is making a successful indie game, and even more so, making a successful business model, building a sustainable company, which is what I've been trying to do with Infinitap, and it's been very challenging. And I think it's it's definitely difficult, and I think a lot of people make one indie game, or they make a few indie games, and then that's it. But I've been indie for 7 years. It's been really challenging, and I think the financial aspect of it has been the most challenging, because unfortunately, I live in the Los Angeles area, and I say unfortunately because the cost of living is bad here, and I mean, in hindsight, probably I could have done something about that. But anyway, you know, there's several successful indies in Los Angeles. There's a great community, but the cost of living is bad. But anyway, I think trying to make ends meet and trying to create something is harder than ever. The technical difficulty of making an indie game has been sort of taken away. You can get Unity or Unreal or whatever and have something playable in 5 minutes. And, that's a great thing. But, the number of games that is released on Steam is just astronomical, and it's only going up. And, it used to be that you would get a certain amount of buzz or success, just for being on a platform like Xbox Live Arcade, PlayStation Network, Steam, whatever. It used to be that was sort of a big deal. Hey, there's a new game here, check it out, And certainly that was my impression of the market when I got into the business. In 2008, I thought, if we have a cool product and we're able to get on PlayStation Network, then, we're all set. And certainly it took us way too long to release Retrograde, but in 2012, when we released Retrograde, there were so many other titles and so many things on PlayStation Network and different promotions and all these other indie games that basically, like, Retrograde was difficult to find when we launched it, and certainly I some of that was bad luck. We thought the Guitar Hero rhythm game thing would last a little longer and people wouldn't throw those out. But I think fundamentally, to make a successful game, you have to make a certain number of assumptions. You have to say that, this is something people will buy. This is something, a fair amount of people will buy because here's your reason and here's how I'm going to market it. And, one of the things that I was thinking about is that with Neverending Nightmares was not a super success. Certainly we did well, and it's been funding Devastated Dreams, but this isn't a Braid or an Antechamber, this is a making ends meet sort of success, which is very uncommon in the indie game development. So I mean, I'm very pleased with Neverending Nightmares and how it's performed. I mean, I guess everyone hopes that, it can be a little more successful or give them a little more breathing room. Like, what we really wanted was being able to fund Devastated Dreams from the profits of Neverending Nightmares, which isn't the case. It didn't sell to that quantity, and so I mean that's why we're on Kickstarter with Devastated Dreams, is because we don't have the money to make the product. And certainly, there's a lot of people who bet big on their game and say that oh, we'll throw everything we have into this and then hope for success. And that's what we did on Retrograde, and it was a big loser. And we bet some sweat equity, and we bet some consulting money and things on Neverending Nightmares, and that paid off. But I mean, and we're certainly betting big on Devastated Dreams, but fundamentally, we can't, I'm not at a position in my life where I can, bet the whole budget and, take out a loan and finance, all the other people who are working on the game, because one of the things to think about is that, games are, your main cost is paying your developers. And, it's great when one person can make a game. But I think, that limits the scope of your game. And it also basically limits how fast you can release a game. And certainly I think the market changes so rapidly that these extended indie development cycles are really scary. And I mean, that was like Retrograde. We had something that probably could have done pretty darn well, had we released it in 2010. But in 2012, it was something no one was interested in. And I think that's often the case. I mean, if you look at how fast things are changing, and what's popular on Steam, a lot of it was survival games, and before that it was roguelikes, and now, it's rocket soccer, playing cars, or whatever. And I'm not saying that you have to, follow these trends, but I think, the business of making a game and selling a game changes rapidly, and it's tough to make the correct assumptions. And so, with Devastated Dreams, we made assumptions on how the product would sell. And, we looked at our core audience of Neverending Nightmares, the people who love Neverending Nightmares, and then we said, we'll create a game that is like that, but better. We'll improve it in a number of ways and fix all the things people have in Neverending Nightmares, and, but we also want to create something that feels different from Neverending Nightmares. So we added a bunch of new features, and we also spent a lot of time on the new art style, and I don't know if you read like the forums or whatever, but this is a bit of sticking point to me, is that I feel that Devastated Dreams is in a completely new art style, and we invested a lot of time into creating that art style, the watercolor look, the shades of gray. But I, think a lot of people just say, oh, it's black and white, the old one's black and white, and I mean, I think that was probably a misstep on my part. I mean, as much as I love the look of Devastated Dreams, I think if people say it looks the same or very similar to Neverending Nightmares, then that's a bad thing. Because I think, with Neverending Nightmares, I wanted to stand out on every way I possibly could, and one of that was the art style. And I think with Devastated Dreams, if people don't dig the art style or don't see it as different from Neverending Nightmares, then that was probably a bad assumption. And and so these bad assumptions can have negative ramifications, and some of your assumptions are going to be like YouTubers will be interested in playing horror games when we release Devastated Dreams in 2016, next year. But that is kind of a scary assumption to make. If you watch like PewDiePie's Five Nights at Freddy's video, he was not overly impressed with it, and perhaps he is not overly impressed with horror in general. Maybe he's taking his channel in a different direction, or maybe he just didn't like Five Nights at Freddy's 4. But I think it's tough to sort of bet the farm on something that relies on a trend that you don't control, and so it's definitely scary, and just I guess making the successful game and marketing it is a huge reason why making a game is so hard, and I think marketing has become more important now than previously, just because again making the game is so much easier. But I had originally wanted to talk about how making the game is challenging in and of itself, and if you look at Neverending Nightmares, we put a lot of time into it. We had basically 4 people working on it full time for close to 2 years, and we had additional contractors, 3 other guys who worked on it here and there. I mean, that's a big team for an indie project, and we were definitely busy. We definitely needed those people, and then even still, people say, hey, there wasn't enough content in the game, and art content is so expensive to make, and certainly, for a horror game, I think you're presented with unique challenges in terms of, making that content, is very important. Whereas, if we had a simple gameplay hook, then the amount of content wouldn't be as important. But making good content and making something that's fun is very difficult, because again, that's something that normally requires making assumptions. You make an assumption that something is going to be interesting or compelling, and then you have to try it. And then a lot of times it turns out to not be interesting or compelling. And I think this is something that everyone faces. And so, like, creating something completely new and unlike everything else is just so challenging. And like with Retrograde, we had the bones of a rhythm game, and we came up with some really cool stuff in a month and a half for our IGF submission. But finishing the game, making all the content, fully exploring the idea is very difficult, because it's easy to create something cool, a prototype that has potential, but to actually see it through to the end and make a polished and compelling experience is so much work. And I think that's very challenging. And I think if you start with something and build off of it, then you're in a better shape. And I think for all of the great things about Neverending Nightmares, there's things we could have done differently, and that was sort of the approach to Devastated Dreams, is create something as more of an evolution than a revolution. And I think that's while I think from a developer standpoint, I think that's a good thing, and I think that's why you see a lot of sequels, and why, Gears of War 2 had a lot of, fixes that Gears of War 1, could have used, and Borderlands 2 had a lot of usability improvements and was in general a better game than Borderlands 1. Um, and I mean, certainly that's not the case. Like, the pre-sequel was not as good as Borderlands 2, but I mean, that was a completely different development team, and they just basically created something in the Borderlands 2 engine. I think that was more like, a financial driven project than a let's create something really that needs to exist sort of project. But I mean, obviously, I could be wrong. Maybe just they had too short of a development schedule. You never know. But basically, that's what I was looking at with Devastated Dreams, and I think that's something that's kind of challenging to do in the indie scene, and I didn't think it was going to be as challenging as it was, but I think, right now, we're sort of relying on brand loyalty to Infinitap games, and I thought that we might get more brand loyalty, in terms of repeat backers from Kickstarter, and in terms of press that was excited about Neverending Nightmares. But I think to some extent, right, we're fighting a new fight. We're starting from scratch, and or close to it, and I think that's really challenging, and that was not an assumption I made. It goes against an assumption I made, which was that we were cultivating the community, and in general, the whole point of this developer diaries and the forums and all of that. I mean, obviously, it's useful to me for focus testing, as I've mentioned several times, but part of it, the idea behind it, was to get people who are interested in Infinitap games, in the projects we're working on, and hold on to them, because I think that's really important. But I think perhaps, again, I made an assumption that that we would be able to grab onto these people, the 3,600 from, Neverending Nightmares Kickstarter, and everyone, people who found out the game and, followed us on Twitter and everything. But it doesn't seem like that's the case, and I mean, that's and it was an important assumption in terms of, meeting our goals, and so I think that's why this Kickstarter campaign has been a lot more challenging than I had expected, because I thought going into it that we could basically float by on people who were interested in Neverending Nightmares, and I think that's, not hasn't been the case. I mean, certainly I imagine a lot of backers, probably all the backers, liked Neverending Nightmares, but comparing this campaign to Neverending Nightmares campaign, I don't think we got many backers who liked Retrograde, because A, there weren't very many people who knew about Retrograde, and B, Retrograde is a completely different genre of game. And so, I mean, I think I'm sort of beginning to understand why a lot of indie companies create totally different games in totally different genres. Because, that unique aspect of the game, that doing something differently, really maybe is important to marketing, unless you have like a huge core fan base, and if you want to make a sequel, I mean, it's almost to the point where depending on your game, of course, but a lot of things like, say, Minecraft, that's sort of games as a service, right? You buy Minecraft and you probably will, get Minecraft updates forever. And that's definitely something, different, and challenging, from a game developer standpoint, as far as managing those expectations. And really it all comes down to money. Is, can you get paid enough such that you can keep doing the work that you love? And I mean, if this Kickstarter fails, then I'm not sure of the answer to that question. And so it's certainly, I'm going to have to rethink every assumption I made about Infinitap Games, about what we're doing, and about how we do that, because I think, if the Kickstarter fails, that's sort of a sign that we were operating on false assumptions. And so we need to figure out, how or if we can survive, based on probably more accurate assumptions, or assumptions that we hope are more accurate. So I mean, it's definitely a very challenging time, and I'm still hopeful that our Kickstarter will pull through, because this is a game that I really want to make, and it's a game I think you'll all love, and I think we have a better understanding of the game we're trying to make, and we really know what we're doing this time around, more so than on Neverending Nightmares. But there's still a lot of hard problems to solve. There's a lot of things that keep me up at night, worrying about puzzles, and worrying about trying to create more content, more variety of content, given our limited budget and schedule. So I mean, even if Devastated Dreams, the Kickstarter succeeds, which, fingers crossed, it's still a challenging game. It's not that we chose to make Devastated Dreams like Neverending Nightmares, and then that solves all of our problems. It's definitely, that's far from the case. But anyway, thanks for watching.